I was humiliated by my own son. He looked me in the eye and demanded I sell the $800,000 house I built with my husband, all for his wife's greed. When he screamed she wouldn't live in some old place, all I could say was, "All right," but he didn't see what I was cooking up. You won't believe what they found in that letter. The scream was deafening. He didn't ask, he demanded. That's the first thing you need to know about my son, Thomas. At 35, he still carried the entitled air of the spoiled little boy I, regrettably, allowed him to become. But this time, the stakes were too high, and his cruelty had finally reached its peak. The scene unfolded right here, in the grand, sun-drenched living room of this $800,000 house. The house that was supposed to be my sanctuary, built on the sweat and love of my late husband, John. I was 62 years old, still navigating the deep silence John left behind 3 years ago, when Thomas and his wife, Sophia, burst in. Sophia, 32, a woman whose entire persona was constructed on high-end brands and the assumption of wealth, didn't even bother with a proper greeting. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the Persian rug and the antique mahogany table, instantly pricing everything. I noticed her slight wrinkle of disgust as she looked at the walls, which, while impeccably maintained, were certainly not the minimalist white boxes she saw in her design magazines. "Mom, we have it all planned out," Thomas began, skipping the pleasantries. He wasn't talking about dinner or my health. He was talking about my life savings, my legacy. He slammed a sheaf of glossy, overpriced architectural sketches onto the table. "Sophia's apartment is pathetic. We need a complete gut renovation, top to bottom." The estimates came back at nearly $300,000. I raised an eyebrow, picking up a sketch showing a chef's kitchen that would see more takeout boxes than actual cooking. "That sounds like your problem, Thomas. Did you come here for a loan?" That's when the betrayal began, sharp and immediate. Thomas leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low roar that still managed to echo in the room. He wasn't asking for a loan. He was issuing an ultimatum, his words perfectly matching the cruel headline I would later see in my mind. "I need the money by tomorrow. The house is worth $800,000, Mom. My wife won't live in some old place. Sell it. Sign the papers tomorrow. You can take whatever the bank gives you for a condo apartment, maybe $100,000, and give us the rest." It's what Dad would have wanted, helping his only son secure his future. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into cold, hard fragments. The audacity, the assumption, the way he casually dismissed the home John and I had poured our souls into, the home that represented 40 years of sacrifice, as some old place his princess couldn't bear to associate with. The deep, hot flush of shame and anger rushed over me, but I swallowed it down. This was the moment. The turning point. The minute I stopped being Thomas's mother and became his judge. Sophia chimed in with a saccharine tone that was worse than his shouting. "It's really for the best, Martha. This house is just too much upkeep for a woman your age. Imagine the freedom. Plus, think of the future grandchildren. We need a proper modern place to raise them." Future grandchildren. They had used that card too many times. I stood up slowly, deliberately. The house, our haven, suddenly felt like a battlefield. Thomas was pacing, clearly expecting tears, pleading, or an emotional collapse, the usual playbook I'd employed over the years to keep the peace. I looked at his handsome, entitled face and saw not my son, but the ghost of his greed. I looked at Sophia and saw only calculation. I took a slow breath, letting my composure solidify into ice. My voice, when it came, was steady, almost too quiet for the demands that had just been shouted. "All right," I said simply. "I will handle it." Thomas froze, completely thrown by my lack of argument. You mean you'll call the realtor? You'll agree to list it tomorrow?" "Yes, Thomas. I said I will handle it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have arrangements to make." I watched the self-satisfied grin spread across his face and the victorious smirk on Sophia's. They truly believed they had won. They thought my silence was surrender. They left a few minutes later, already discussing the materials for their new master bath. They had no idea that in agreeing so easily, I hadn't surrendered my house. I had reclaimed my life, and I had sealed the truth behind a deadly secret. The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. I locked the door behind them, and for the first time since John died, a powerful, determined strength, a cold, vengeful calm, filled the massive $800,000 space. It was time to deal with the debt they owed me. The emotional debt of decades of betrayal. Chapter 2: John's Legacy and the Betrayal, 750 to 800 words. The immediate silence after they left was deafening, but it was a welcome sound. It wasn't the empty silence of grief. It was the sharp, focused silence of a woman planning an escape. My alright had bought me precious hours. I walked through the house, my fortress, and for the first time, I looked at it not as a home, but as a monument to my betrayal. This was the house that John and I, immigrants from the old country, had scrimped and saved for. It was our masterpiece. And now, it was nothing more than a giant check waiting to be cashed by a greedy child. I went straight to my husband's old study, a room Thomas rarely entered, finding its mahogany and leather too dark and old-fashioned. The air in there always smelled faintly of John's pipe tobacco and his endless hope. I sat at his desk and pulled out the large, worn velvet box I hadn't opened since the lawyer finalized the estate 3 years ago. Inside, among the insurance papers and deeds, was the document I needed. It wasn't the main will. That document, Thomas had read, scanned, and memorized, confirming he would eventually inherit everything upon my death. John knew Thomas's temperament, though. He knew his son was a user, always looking for the easiest path to riches, and he had set a brilliant, beautiful trap, a safety net for me, tucked away in the shadows of the main legal filing. I pulled out the irrevocable usufruct agreement and trust. John had created a separate, self-executing trust that essentially granted me the irrevocable right to the use and enjoyment of the house and its profits until my death. More importantly, it stipulated that the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or otherwise encumbered without the express, notarized written consent of me, Martha, and a designated secondary trustee. This trustee was John's cousin, Raphael, a quiet lawyer in the city whom Thomas had always dismissed as a distant, unimportant relative. The clause itself was the secret I'd been keeping. Thomas, blinded by the $800,000 figure, had focused only on the part of the main will that guaranteed him the principal. He was too arrogant to check the footnotes, too confident that his mother, a simple homemaker, would never understand legal jargon. He assumed John would have protected him. But John protected me. A tide of warm, painful reflection washed over me as I held the paper. John had a great sense of humor, but when it came to business, he was a stone wall. I remembered the day about a decade ago when Thomas, just out of college, had tried to convince John to co-sign a huge loan for a disastrous startup idea. John had politely refused, giving Thomas a lengthy lecture on earned wealth. Later that night, John confessed to me, "Martha, our son loves the idea of money more than he loves us. We must be prepared." That night, John began the process of setting up the usufruct with Raphael. He foresaw the very moment that Thomas would try to pressure me after his death. He foresaw the betrayal. The document was John's final, silent act of love and protection. I laid the agreement on the desk and smiled, a slow, cold, deliberate smile. My heart ached, not for the house, but for the loss of the idyllic life I'd imagined for my family. Thomas was forcing me to trade my life of comfort for a life of freedom. He was demanding I pay his wife's debt. Fine. I would pay it not with money, but with the painful shame of the truth. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper, the best parchment, and prepared to write the letter that would serve as his judgment. But before I could do that, I needed to make sure my escape was perfectly planned. The physical preparations could wait. The legal and financial ones had to be executed immediately, digitally, before Thomas could wake up and demand control. I needed to empty my cup and fill my own coffers. I had about $150,000 in liquid assets, mostly my pension and some mutual funds John had quietly set up in my name alone. Thomas knew about the main joint accounts, but these were my small, personal secrets. I opened my laptop and began the systematic process of transferring every cent into a newly created, untraceable online account. This wasn't about theft. It was about self-preservation. This money, which Thomas was so quick to claim, was the life raft John had prepared for me. The clock was ticking, and with every click, I was pulling myself further away from the emotional and financial chains of my son. The house, my beautiful, costly prison, was about to become Thomas's burden. I looked at the usufruct document again. I had all the power, and I was finally ready to use it. This was the night of the long knives. Chapter 3. The Red Flags of Greed, 750 to 800 words. Before I could execute the final financial transactions, I was forced into another moment of painful reflection. To justify the extreme measure I was about to take, abandoning my son and leaving him with a crippling legal entanglement, I had to confront the years of subtle and not-so-subtle red flags. It wasn't just this $800,000 demand. This was the climax of a decades-long pattern of exploitation and greed that John had tried to shield me from. The first flag was small, almost cute in retrospect. Thomas was just 8 years old. John and I had bought him a new, expensive bicycle, the kind he'd begged for. 3 days later, he sold it to a neighborhood boy for half the price and claimed it was stolen, then used the cash to buy a dozen sugary treats he didn't share. When John confronted him, Thomas's reaction wasn't guilt, but indignation. "I got what I wanted, Dad. It was a good deal for me." The seed of self-interest was already planted deep. As he grew older, the demands became financial. During high school, he always needed the latest gadgets, always insisted on the most expensive university, even though he barely applied himself, and always found a way to run out of money right before rent or tuition was due. John, ever the generous and hoping father, would sigh and bail him out, telling me, "He'll grow out of it, Martha. He just needs time to mature." But I saw the calculation in Thomas's eyes. He knew exactly how far he could push. The arrival of Sophia was another massive red flag. She was beautiful, yes, but her affection for Thomas seemed directly proportional to his bank balance. When they started dating, she made it very clear that this house, and the eventual inheritance, was a key part of her long-term plan. She subtly encouraged Thomas's worst tendencies, framing his demands on us as necessary steps toward generational wealth. I remember the sheer, cold horror of overhearing Sophia tell Thomas, "Your mother is old-fashioned. Just get her to sign the power of attorney. It will be so much easier when she passes." This wasn't just casual cruelty, it was weaponized betrayal. The worst incident, the one that made John finalize the usufruct, happened 5 years ago. John had a minor heart scare, and while he was still recovering, Thomas showed up with a mortgage broker, trying to convince John to take out a $400,000 equity loan on the house, money Thomas planned to use to invest in a friend's dubious real estate scheme. John, pale and weak, had flatly refused. When Thomas left, John was shaking. "He didn't even ask if I was well, Martha," he whispered. "He only saw the dollar signs." That's when he went to Raphael and sealed the secret legal protection. He didn't want me to experience this kind of humiliation alone. Now, sitting in the heart of the home, with the memory of John's disappointment heavy in the air, I realized Thomas's latest demand wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable conclusion of his character. He saw the house as a physical symbol of his birthright, a commodity to be liquidated for his own comfort and to placate Sophia's expensive taste. His casual dismissal of my home as an old place his wife wouldn't live in was the final straw, the ultimate act of disrespect. My resolve hardened. This was no longer about money. It was about integrity and justice. I finalized the wire transfers, confirming the $150,000 was safely in the new account, my escape fund. I also secured all my personal jewelry, some small pieces John had given me that held more emotional value than any gold or diamond could. These were the only physical items I would take. Everything else, the furniture, the electronics, the beautiful dishes, would stay behind. I was leaving the shell of the house to them, a monument to their avarice, soon to be tainted by legal headache and debt. The only thing I was taking was the piece John had intended for me. The weight of the years of shame lifted as I prepared for the quiet, solitary act of leaving. I was ready to become a ghost in my own life. Chapter 4. Writing the Judgment Letter, 750 to 800 words. The sun had set completely, bathing the room in the blue-black hue of midnight. I knew Thomas and Sophia were already asleep, dreaming of new marble countertops and walk-in closets, confident that their elderly mother was already scrambling to call a realtor. Their overconfidence was my greatest ally. I poured myself a single glass of water, sat back down at John's desk, and began to write the letter. The final word, the judgment that would expose their betrayal. This couldn't be a simple farewell note. It had to be a meticulously worded document that was both emotionally devastating and legally sound. It needed to explain my departure without sounding desperate and detail their inheritance without sounding like a threat. It had to be delivered with the cold, hard force of the truth they had avoided for so long. I started with a simple, yet loaded, salutation. My dearest Thomas and Sophia, though I struggle to call you either. The first paragraph addressed the demand directly. I wrote about the humiliation of being ordered to sell my home to fund a frivolous renovation. I didn't yell on paper. I used calm, descriptive words that reflected the cold, hard disappointment in my heart. When you stood here today and called this house an old place, not fit for your future, you didn't just insult me. You desecrated the memory of the man who sacrificed everything to build it. Then came the secret, the legal core of the letter. This part had to be crystal clear, leaving no room for doubt or lawyers to maneuver. I outlined the existence of the irrevocable usufruct agreement and trust, citing its filing number and the name of the secondary trustee, Raphael. I explained in detail what Thomas had always failed to grasp. He was the principal beneficiary of the equity upon my death, yes, but until then I had absolute, unchallengeable control. You were so eager to seize the $800,000 that you overlooked the fine print your father ensured was there. The usufruct protects me, and it means this house cannot be sold without my and Raphael's consent. I have notified Raphael of my departure, and he is legally bound to refuse any request from you to liquidate the property. I will never consent. Therefore, the $800,000 you demanded is entirely out of your reach. You have lost the sale. I let that sink in for a moment before moving to the truly devastating part, the financial counterblow. John and I had a strategy for the last year that involved delaying some less critical financial obligations to build up my emergency fund, a plan that would now sting Thomas. You claimed you would inherit this house someday, and technically you will. However, per the terms of the trust, the immediate successor, you, is responsible for all outstanding property taxes, municipal fees, and maintenance costs upon the departure or incapacitation of the primary usufructuary, me. I have not paid the last 18 months of property taxes, nor the last 2 quarters of municipal services. That debt, totaling nearly $40,000, is now legally yours, effective at the moment I leave this property. I could almost hear their enraged screams just writing the words. They demanded a windfall. I gave them an immediate, hefty debt and a worthless asset they couldn't sell. I finished the letter with a personal flourish, refusing their request to see me beg or cry. You demanded that I pay your wife's $300,000 debt. I have paid it, Thomas, not in cash, but by finally canceling the debt I owed you as a mother. I am leaving this house and every material thing in it. You are left with the empty shell, the mounting bills, and the full weight of your conscience. Enjoy your old place. I have bought my freedom. I signed it simply, Martha. I sealed the letter in a plain white envelope, addressed to Thomas and Sophia. The weight of it in my hand was the weight of years of suppressed pain finally being released. The judgment was written. Now it was time for the final preparations for my physical disappearance. My escape, my quiet act of rebellion, would commence before the first light of dawn. Chapter 5, My Digital Disappearance, 750 to 800 words. The hardest part of the plan was disconnecting. I had already secured the $150,000. Transferring it into a complex, multi-layer offshore account John had helped me set up years ago as a contingency, a true secret buried beneath layers of financial paperwork. But now I had to systematically dismantle every digital trace that could lead them to me, severing the last visible ties to my old identity. First, I dealt with the main bank accounts, the joint accounts Thomas knew about and constantly monitored. I left a token $500 in the checking account, just enough to not immediately trigger a fraud alert, but not enough to be worth their time. I officially notified the bank, via an encrypted email John had taught me to use, that I would be traveling extensively and asked them to redirect all future mail and correspondence to a defunct P.O. box address in a different state. It was a digital smokescreen. Next came the phone. I powered down my old smartphone, removed the SIM card, and snapped it in half. This was surprisingly emotional. That phone held years of pictures, messages, and memories, the only remnants of John's voice and my connection to the outside world. But sentimentality would only lead to betrayal. I couldn't risk GPS tracking or them simply pinging the old number. I placed the broken SIM and the phone in a Ziploc bag, which would travel with me until I could safely dispose of it in a completely different region. I then accessed my email and social media. I systematically deleted old accounts Thomas knew I used, created new encrypted ones with entirely different names and personas, and unsubscribed from every mailing list, magazine, and notification that had my home address attached. It was meticulous, time-consuming work, but every delete button I pressed was another brick crumbling from my prison wall. It felt empowering, a final declaration of independence from the life that had been dictated by the expectation of me being a good mother who would sacrifice everything. This process brought on a fresh wave of reflection. I realized how much of my life was digital, how easy it was for someone, especially a calculating son, to monitor my movements and finances. I felt a stinging shame that I had allowed myself to become so predictable, so easily manipulated. John, ever the pragmatist, had warned me about this dependency. He always insisted I keep a small cache of physical cash and gold hidden, and tonight I retrieved it, a handful of gold coins and about $5,000 in crisp, unmarked bills, my immediate lifeline. I also had to deal with the smaller, yet critical items. The car. The beautiful vintage sedan that John restored himself. Thomas was planning on taking it immediately after the house sale. I took the keys, placed them on the kitchen counter, and enclosed a note. The car is yours. Title is in the glove compartment. Enjoy the gas payments and maintenance. It was a final small act of malice, knowing that the cost of running that luxury car would be another drain on his already burdened finances. I was leaving them gifts that were actually curses. The silence of the house magnified the tiny clicking sounds of my laptop keys. By 3 a.m., my old life was officially dark. My financial escape was complete, my communications severed, and my physical path clear. I was ready to leave the $800,000 house, carrying only the most precious emotional cargo and the secret that would change Thomas's life forever. I turned off the computer, took the sealed letter, and went to the window to watch the first hint of gray light on the horizon. My freedom was only moments away, and the final emotional storm was about to break. I felt no regret, only the cold, sharp edge of finality. Chapter 6, The Great Escape, 750 to 800 words. The clock struck 4 a.m., the time of the Great Escape. I moved through the silent house like a ghost, every movement purposeful and quiet. I was wearing simple travel clothes, comfortable black slacks, a modest sweater, and the single strand of pearls John gave me on our 30th anniversary. These pearls weren't a luxury. They were a reminder of the wealth I valued. Not money, but love. I picked up the small duffel bag containing my emergency cash, the gold coins, my new phone, and the broken SIM card. This bag, small enough to be mistaken for a gym bag, held my entire future. The rest of the house, the vast furniture, the paintings, the silver, was their problem now. I felt a surge of cold freedom washing over the old shame of feeling trapped. The last room I entered was the kitchen. It was John's favorite. I took a final look at the stainless steel refrigerator Thomas was so desperate to replace with something smarter. I didn't weep. Instead, I remembered John's words. Martha, a house is just walls. Home is where you are. I poured out the last cup of coffee in the pot, placed the empty cup neatly in the sink, and then picked up the two most important items, the sealed letter and the house keys. I walked to the front door. This heavy oak door, which had sheltered me for 40 years, now felt like the gate to my prison. I paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. This was the point of no return. I carefully slipped the envelope containing my full judgment into the mail slot, making sure it was visible but securely inside. I dropped the heavy ring of keys, the keys to the $800,000 house, into a small flower pot right next to the door. With one last final push, I pulled the door shut and engaged the deadbolt. Click. The sound was final, a gunshot ringing out in the early morning silence. I was officially homeless and yet completely free. I walked down the driveway, not looking back. I wasn't leaving a home. I was leaving a life that tried to consume me. A pre-booked taxi, which I had arranged using my new, untraceable burner phone and an alias, was waiting discreetly 2 blocks away. I got in without speaking, giving the driver the address of the train station downtown. I avoided the main airport, knowing Thomas would check that first. A long, circuitous train ride was the perfect way to melt into the landscape. As the taxi pulled onto the main street, I glanced at the side mirror. The house looked magnificent in the pre-dawn light, a solid monument to a happy past and a terrifying present. I felt a pang of something akin to grief, but it wasn't for the property. It was for the son I had lost. His greed had been my final liberation. 2 hours later, I was on a high-speed train, watching the city fade into a blur of concrete and trees. I was physically exhausted but mentally alert, buzzing with adrenaline and a strange, cold peace. The train stopped at a small suburb halfway to my planned destination. I was about to turn off the burner phone when it buzzed. A text message. My heart thumped once hard. It was from Thomas's number. MOM. Where are you? The realtor needs a signature. Are you trying to delay this? Pick up the phone. I swear to God, don't try to play games with me. He was still in the denial phase. He still believed he could order me around. I felt a powerful, triumphant surge of cold satisfaction. I quickly replied, using the new phone, sending the briefest, most enigmatic message. Check the door. Then, I turned the phone off and removed the battery. He was on his way to his fate, rushing toward the empty house and the letter that contained the full measure of his betrayal. I settled back in my seat, finally allowing myself to smile. The game was on. Chapter 7. The Discovery of the Locked Door, 750 to 800 words. I was hours away, watching the vast, open plains roll past my train window, but my mind was back in that living room, replaying the scene of their inevitable return. I could feel the tension, the rising panic, the confusion that would soon turn to blinding rage. I was their audience, even miles away, and I relished the mental image of the moment they discovered my secret. It would have been late morning when Thomas and Sophia finally drove up to the house. They wouldn't have been early. Thomas never was, relying on his assumption that I would be waiting anxiously for his call. I imagined them pulling up the long circular driveway, Sophia already texting friends about her upcoming renovation, Thomas ready to dispense orders to me. I could see the first flicker of irritation in Thomas's eyes as he noticed my car was still in the driveway, but mine wasn't. Then the growing annoyance as he rang the doorbell, once, twice, 3 times, before impatiently pounding on the oak door. Mom, I know you're in there. Stop playing games. Sophia, of course, would have already checked the windows, noting the curtains were drawn. Unusual for me. She would have seen the car keys on the counter, realizing the small, practical items were still there, but my presence wasn't. Then comes the pivotal moment. Thomas, frustrated, probably kicking at the base of the door, would have glanced down. That's when his eye would catch the envelope tucked securely in the mail slot. A plain, white envelope, addressed simply to Thomas and Sophia. Curiosity, tinged with a sudden spike of dread, would have replaced his arrogance. I can hear him, even now, barking at Sophia. The keys. Where are the keys? She wouldn't leave without the keys. They would find the heavy ring in the flower pot, another small detail confirming my departure. The door would be locked. The keys would be useless until they opened the door from the inside. They would have to break the lock to get in, but Thomas, the careful heir, wouldn't dare damage the $800,000 asset he thought was his. So, they would tear open the letter right there on the doorstep, the expensive architectural sketches of Sophia's dream renovation still clutched in her hand. They would read the beginning, the part about the humiliation and the betrayal, and Thomas would scoff, rolling his eyes at Sophia. Just Mom being dramatic. But then they would hit the second paragraph, the legal core. The secret. The irrevocable usufruct agreement and trust. I imagine Thomas's face draining of color. He's a smart man when it comes to business, but a lazy one when it comes to family history. The realization that his father, John, had set a trap that Thomas had never bothered to investigate would hit him like a physical blow. He would read the name Raphael and scoff, saying, "Who the hell is Raphael?" before Sophia, probably panicking, would furiously Google the lawyer's name and realize he was real, a respected lawyer whose hands were tied by the trust. The $800,000 was gone. Out of reach. Permanently. I leaned my head against the cool train window, letting the imagined scene unfold. The shame I had carried for years, the shame of failing as a mother, of being exploited, was now transferred entirely onto their shoulders. They had been exposed, legally thwarted, and publicly shamed in their own minds at least. The house was a trophy they couldn't touch. And the worst was yet to come. They hadn't read about the debts yet. I knew that moment would come next, and that's when the screaming would start. I was ready for it. I was finally free. Chapter 8. The Legal Trap Springs Shut, 750 to 800 words. The train pulled into the station of my final planned destination, a small, quiet coastal town John and I had always dreamed of retiring to. I checked into a simple, inexpensive guest house under an assumed name. My new life was modest, but it was mine, free from the tyranny of Thomas's demands. But even as I unpacked my meager belongings, my mind was still fixed on the confrontation unfolding hundreds of miles away. This was the moment of complete judgment. After the initial shock of the irrevocable usufruct, they would have continued reading the letter. Thomas, now driven by pure, frantic desperation, would have been shouting the words aloud, pacing back and forth on the expensive stone porch. Per the terms of the trust, the immediate successor, you, is responsible for all outstanding property taxes, municipal fees, and maintenance costs upon the departure or incapacitation of the primary usufructuary, me. I have not paid the last 18 months of property taxes, nor the last 2 quarters of municipal services. That debt, totaling nearly $40,000, is now legally yours, effective at the moment I leave this property. I could visualize Sophia's reaction perfectly, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. The $800,000 payday was gone, replaced by a $40,000 bill. They hadn't just lost the renovation money. They had inherited a crippling debt on a house they couldn't sell. The betrayal they intended to inflict was returned tenfold. Thomas, the successful real estate investor, at least in his own mind, would immediately rush to his phone. He'd call Raphael, the secondary trustee, the man he once dismissed. I imagined Raphael, calm and professional, confirming the terms of the usufruct, politely stating that Martha had given clear instructions not to consent to any sale. Thomas would be met with an unmovable legal wall built by his own father. Then would come the panic. Thomas would call his own lawyer, who would confirm the legality of the usufruct and the liability for the immediate costs. The lawyer would explain the gravity of the situation. To prevent the house from being seized by the state for tax delinquency, Thomas would have to immediately pay the $40,000 debt. If he didn't, the state would seize the property, and Thomas would get nothing. Not the house, not the eventual equity, nothing. His own greed had forced him into a corner. I felt a quiet, chilling satisfaction. They had demanded I implore them for mercy, but instead, I had made them face a debt they couldn't ignore. The $40,000 wasn't just money. It was the cost of their arrogance. They had to pay to prevent the total shame of the house being publicly seized. My confession to you, the viewer, now turns to reflection on justice. People might say my actions were cruel, that I abandoned my son, but I didn't abandon him. I cut the leash. He was suffocating me, slowly draining my resources and my spirit. My departure was not an act of malice, but an act of self-preservation, ensuring that the final decade of my life was not spent financing the luxurious whims of his wife. The final words of the letter, which Thomas must have read in a choked-up fury, would have been the ultimate sting. You demanded that I pay your wife's $300,000 debt. I have paid it, Thomas, not in cash, but by finally canceling the debt I owed you as a mother. I am leaving this house and every material thing in it. You are left with the empty shell, the mounting bills, and the full weight of your conscience. Enjoy your old place. The judgment was sealed. All that was left was the sound of their screaming. Chapter 9, The Final Desperate Plea, 750 to 800 words. Life in the coastal town was exactly what I needed. Simple, quiet, and utterly unremarkable. I had rented a small apartment overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and freedom. My $150,000, now safely invested in conservative funds, felt like a king's ransom compared to the emotional and financial cost of my former life. I spent my days walking the beach, reading John's old books, and finally processing the grief I hadn't allowed myself to feel while I was still fighting Thomas. But even perfect solitude has interruptions. My burner phone, which I used sparingly, buzzed late one evening. It was an unknown number, but the area code was familiar. It was from my old city. I knew instinctively it was Thomas. After all the voicemails and texts I'd ignored on my old number, this was his final, desperate measure. I hesitated, the phone heavy in my hand. I had promised myself I was done, but the human part of me, the mother part, needed one final confirmation of the truth. I needed to hear the sound of his voice, not in anger, but in submission. I answered. Hello. I kept my voice low and neutral. The man on the other end wasn't the arrogant prince who had yelled at me days ago. This voice was raw, frayed, laced with genuine panic. Mom? Martha, is that you? It's Thomas. I let the silence hang there, heavy and accusatory. He plunged straight into his prepared monologue. Mom, please. We need to talk. This isn't fair. That usufruct thing, the taxes. It's ridiculous. It's illegal. You can't just stick us with your debt. We had plans, Mom. Sophia is furious, and the lawyer. He says it's all ironclad. We have to pay the $40,000 by the end of the month, or we lose the house completely. I swear to God, Mom, I'll lose everything. His use of the word I was telling. Not we, but Sophia had clearly thrown him under the bus. You called it an old place, Thomas, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet firm enough to silence his hysteria. Why are you fighting so hard to keep an old place? That's too much upkeep for a woman my age. It's about the principle, Mom. And the money. It was Dad's legacy. It's my birthright. You are being so incredibly selfish. After everything we've done for you, you run away like this. The sheer irony of his words, his projection of egoism onto me, was the final straw. What you did for me, Thomas, was demand the sale of my home to fund your wife's luxury bath. You demanded I pay the $300,000 debt that belonged to you. That's not love, that's exploitation. He dissolved into choked up, manipulative sobs. Please, Mom, I'm imploring you. Come back. Just sign the sale papers. We can split the money 50-50. You can take $400,000 and buy a beautiful place. Don't do this to me. Don't let me sink. I felt the last vestige of maternal weakness die in my chest. He wasn't crying for me. He was crying for his lost $800,000. I have bought my peace, Thomas. And my peace is not for sale. That house and the debt attached to it is the cost of your greed. Enjoy your old place. I didn't wait for his reply. I hung up the phone, pulled the battery, and then, using a hammer from my toolbox, I smashed the burner phone into irreparable pieces. The break was final. The physical severing of the final digital cord. The mother I used to be was gone, and the free woman John always wanted me to be had finally emerged. The sound of the hammer hitting the plastic was the sound of my definitive release from decades of shame and betrayal. I was ready for the conclusive end. Chapter 10, The Conclusive Judgment and the Peace Polemic, 750 to 800 words. And so here we are. This is the final part of my confession, the resolution you need to understand the full measure of my actions. You saw the humiliation, the betrayal, and the dramatic escape. Now you deserve the final judgment. After I smashed the phone, I entered a period of total, blissful silence. I spent weeks assuming Thomas and Sophia were locked in a desperate battle with the legal system and their own mounting shame. I was right. 6 months later, I received an official, impersonal letter from Raphael, John's trusted lawyer. Thomas, unable to afford the escalating property taxes and the $40,000 in immediate debt, had tried every legal maneuver to contest the usufruct. Every single one failed. He had to scrape together every cent he had, including selling off some of Sophia's luxury items, just to cover the taxes and prevent the seizure of the house. He was trapped. He owned the title to a house he couldn't live in. It was still technically my legal residence through the trust, and couldn't sell. Their relationship, Raphael hinted, had deteriorated rapidly, consumed by the financial stress and the realization that their windfall was a curse. But the story doesn't end with Thomas merely suffering. I needed to ensure that John's legacy, the house built on honest sacrifice, didn't end as a monument to Thomas's greed. This is the polemic part. I used one final little-known clause in the usufruct. It allowed me, as the primary beneficiary, to transfer the usufruct to a non-profit entity after a waiting period, provided all debts were settled by the successor, Thomas. Since Thomas had paid the $40,000 debt to prevent foreclosure, the property was legally unencumbered by the state. I contacted a local charity focused on providing safe housing for domestic abuse survivors. Quietly and without fanfare, I signed the papers, transferring my irrevocable use of the $800,000 house to them. Thomas still technically owned the house title, but the charity now held the usufruct, meaning they could occupy and use the property until his death. And, crucially, they could charge Thomas for any remaining maintenance costs. The legal notification Thomas received was brutal. He was informed that his empty asset was now fully occupied by a charitable organization, and he remained the title holder, responsible for certain capital repairs. He couldn't sell it, couldn't live in it, and had to keep it up for the charity. The house was finally doing good, and Thomas was footing the bill. My confession now ends on my simple balcony. My life is small but rich. I used a tiny fraction of my $150,000 to start the John and Martha Benevolent Fund, a small foundation that quietly helps other viewed as widows achieve financial independence. The money my son was so eager to exploit is now helping women who were once in my shoes. The final word I received was a legal threat from Thomas, a desperate, final roar of rage. I simply forwarded it to Raphael. I never looked back. My piece is complete. Some may say I was cruel to my own blood, that I should have simply signed the papers and avoided the drama. But if I had done that, I would have died inside, consumed by the shame of enabling his wickedness. I would have died without ever standing up for myself and the memory of my John. The $800,000 house is gone. My son is gone. And the woman who was afraid to speak is gone. I lost a son, but I gained my soul. That, my friends, is a trade I would make every single time. My story is over. The price of their greed was my ultimate freedom.